I knelt at my husband's grave with lilies in hand, but someone had already been there. Fresh roses sat against the stone with a card that read, "To my beloved husband from your devoted wife." I was his only wife. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I'm 72 years old. I've been a widow for 6 months now, though some days it feels like 6 years, and other days it feels like just yesterday that I was holding Robert's hand as he took his last breath. People in our small Connecticut town knew us as the couple who still held hands at the grocery store after 47 years of marriage. They'd smile at us in the checkout line, and I'd feel proud, thinking we were proof that real love could last a lifetime. I was a second-grade teacher for 30 years at Riverside Elementary. I was the kind of teacher who remembered every student's name, who bought winter coats for kids who needed them with my own money, who stayed late to tutor struggling readers. My students called me Mrs. Hayes, but to my own 3 children and 5 grandchildren, I was simply Mom and Grandma, the woman who never missed a school play, who baked chocolate chip cookies every Sunday, who kept photo albums organized by year and event. Robert and I built our life together in a pale yellow house on Maple Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We planted the oak tree in the front yard when our daughter Michelle was born. We renovated the kitchen after Robert got his promotion at the insurance company, where he worked as an adjuster. We paid off the mortgage 5 years before he retired, and I remember how we celebrated with champagne and dancing in our living room, like young newlyweds. I was the kind of wife who ironed Robert's work shirts every Sunday evening while watching our favorite television shows. I learned to make his mother's pot roast recipe just the way he liked it. When he traveled for work conferences, I'd pack his suitcase carefully and slip little notes into his pockets, telling him I'd miss him. On our anniversary every year, we'd go to the same Italian restaurant where he proposed, and he'd order the same wine we had that night in 1978. When Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, I became his full-time caregiver without hesitation. I scheduled every doctor's appointment, researched every treatment option, administered every medication on time. I learned to give injections, even though needles terrified me. I slept in a recliner chair beside his hospital bed that we set up in our living room so I could hear him if he needed anything during the night. I held his hand through the pain, read to him when he couldn't sleep, and assured him everything would be okay, even when we both knew it wouldn't be. The morning Robert died, I was lying next to him on that hospital bed, our fingers intertwined. His last words to me were, "Thank you for everything, Ellie." I held those words like a sacred treasure, replaying them in my mind during the darkest moments of grief that followed. I thought I knew everything about my husband and our life together. That cold November morning at the cemetery, I was about to discover I had been living inside a carefully constructed lie for 40 years. For 47 years, my life followed a rhythm so steady and comfortable that I never questioned it. Robert and I had built something I believed was rare and precious, a marriage that actually worked. We weren't the couple who fought over money or went to bed angry. We were the couple that other couples looked at and said, "I want what they have." Every Saturday morning started the same way for decades. Robert would wake up early and make pancakes from scratch using his grandmother's recipe, and I'd sit at the kitchen table reading the newspaper while the smell of butter and vanilla filled our home. He'd always make mine with extra blueberries because he remembered that's how I liked them on our first breakfast together as newlyweds. We'd eat slowly, talking about nothing important: the weather, the neighbors, plans for the garden. Our Wednesday nights were sacred. That's when we'd call the kids, one by one, checking in on their lives. Michelle in Ohio with her accounting firm, and 2 boys, Robert Jr. in Colorado with his wife and twin daughters, Tommy in Boston, still unmarried but thriving as a graphic designer. Robert would put the phone on speaker and we'd sit side by side on the couch, both talking to our children, finishing each other's sentences the way longtime couples do. Robert worked as an insurance adjuster for 38 years at Morrison & Associates downtown. His job required occasional travel, conferences in other cities, client meetings that kept him away for a few days at a time. I never minded. I trusted him completely. When he'd come home from those trips, he'd always bring me something small, a keychain from whatever city he'd visited, a box of local chocolates, once a beautiful scarf from a craft fair in Vermont. I'd kiss him at the door and help him unpack, listening to stories about boring meetings and difficult clients. After Robert retired 5 years ago, we entered what I thought would be our golden years. We spent our mornings working in the garden together. Him on his knees planting tomatoes, me pruning the rose bushes I'd cultivated for 20 years. We took afternoon walks around the neighborhood, waving to neighbors who'd known us since our children were small. We'd stop at the park and sit on our favorite bench, the one overlooking the pond, and Robert would put his arm around me while we watched the ducks. We traveled a little. Nothing extravagant, just weekend trips to visit the kids or week-long drives through New England to see the fall foliage. Robert would drive while I navigated with maps spread across my lap, and we'd stop at small diners and antique shops along the way. In the evenings, we'd play cards with our neighbors, the Hendersons, or watch old movies on television with bowls of popcorn. When Robert got sick, our rhythm changed, but our bond seemed to deepen. Or so I thought. I'd sit beside his bed reading him passages from his favorite books. He'd hold my hand and tell me I was his angel, his everything. During those final, terrible months, I felt closer to him than ever before. I was certain that our love story, despite its tragic ending, was genuine and complete. I had no idea that while I was living my truth, Robert was living a lie. It was the 5th Sunday after Robert's funeral when everything began to unravel, though I didn't know it yet. I had established a routine in my grief. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, I'd drive to Riverside Cemetery with fresh lilies, Robert's favorite flower. I'd spend about 20 minutes there, talking to him the way I used to talk to him over morning coffee, telling him about the kids, about what was happening in the neighborhood, about how much I missed him. That particular Sunday was cold for early November. The sky hung gray and heavy with clouds that threatened rain. I parked my car near the old oak tree at the cemetery entrance, the same spot I always chose, and walked the familiar path up the gentle hill toward Robert's grave. My arms were full of white lilies I'd bought from the florist on Market Street, the expensive ones because Robert deserved the best. But as I climbed the hill, something felt wrong. From a distance, I could see Robert's headstone, the gray granite we'd chosen together years ago when we'd made our final arrangements, being practical even about death. But there was something else there, too. Something that shouldn't be there. I slowed my steps, squinting against the cold wind. Flowers. Someone had already left flowers on Robert's grave. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't have explained why. I approached slowly as if I were sneaking up on something fragile that might disappear if I moved too quickly. The flowers were roses, a dozen long-stemmed red roses, the expensive kind that come from a real florist, not a grocery store. They were fresh, so fresh that morning dew still clung to the petals. They'd been placed there recently, maybe within the last hour. I stood there completely still, holding my lilies, staring at those roses like they were a puzzle I couldn't solve. In 6 months of widowhood, I had been the only one bringing flowers to Robert's grave. Our children lived out of state. Michelle was in Ohio, Robert Jr. in Colorado, Tommy in Boston. They visited once a month at most, and they always called to let me know they were coming. Our neighbors were kind, but not the type to make cemetery visits. Robert's co-workers had sent flowers to the funeral, but that was months ago. So who had left these roses? I looked around the empty cemetery, suddenly feeling exposed, like someone was watching me. The wind picked up, rustling through the bare tree branches, and I shivered. There was something about those roses that felt wrong, not just unexpected, but intrusive. They were too romantic, too deliberate, too intimate for a casual gesture from a friend or colleague. I knelt down and placed my lilies carefully beside the roses, my hands trembling slightly, though I told myself it was just from the cold. I touched Robert's headstone, running my fingers over his name carved in stone. "Who brought you roses, sweetheart?" I whispered. The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. I stayed there longer than usual that day, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that was crawling up my spine like cold fingers. When I finally walked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at Robert's grave, watching me leave. I spent the entire drive home trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Grief does strange things to the mind. I'd read about it in the support group pamphlets the hospice nurse had given me. Maybe I was inventing mysteries where there were none, seeing threats in kind gestures, turning paranoia into entertainment, because my life had become so empty without Robert. Of course, people would visit his grave. Robert had been well-liked, respected in the community. He'd worked at Morrison & Associates for nearly 4 decades. He'd coached Little League baseball when our boys were young. He'd been on the church finance committee for years. It made perfect sense that someone who cared about him would leave flowers. The roses were probably from a grateful client whose claim Robert had handled years ago. Or maybe from someone at church who remembered his kindness. I pulled into our driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the yellow house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. I was being ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. A jealous widow imagining drama because I had too much time on my hands and too many empty hours to fill. That evening, I called our daughter Michelle, trying to sound casual. "Honey, did you or your brothers happen to visit Dad's grave this morning?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear her 2 boys arguing about something in the background. "No, Mom. We're planning to come up next weekend for his 6-month anniversary. Why? Is everything okay?" I forced lightness into my voice. "Oh, it's nothing really. Someone left some beautiful roses there today, and I just wondered if it was one of you." Michelle's voice softened with concern. "That's sweet. Probably someone from his old office? Dad knew so many people, Mom. He touched a lot of lives." "You're right," I agreed quickly, wanting to end the conversation before she heard the uncertainty in my voice. "That's exactly what I thought. I'll see you next weekend, sweetheart." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. The following days, I threw myself into distractions with almost frantic energy. I reorganized the linen closet, a job I'd been putting off for months. I baked 3 batches of chocolate chip cookies for the church fundraiser, even though they'd only asked for one. I volunteered to babysit my neighbor's grandson. I alphabetized the spice cabinet. Anything to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. But every night, lying alone in the bed Robert and I had shared for 47 years, I would think about those roses. I'd stare at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the house settle and creak, and wonder whose hands had placed those flowers on my husband's grave. I'd imagine scenarios: a former coworker, a distant cousin, a neighbor I'd somehow forgotten about. On Wednesday, I almost convinced myself to let it go entirely. I even laughed at myself while making breakfast, shaking my head at my own foolishness. But Thursday night, I lay awake until 3 in the morning, that uneasy feeling growing heavier in my chest. By Friday, I knew I had to go back to the cemetery the following Sunday, even though part of me was terrified of what I might find. Sunday morning arrived with gray clouds and a bitter wind that cut through my coat. I woke up early, my stomach tight with anxiety I couldn't explain. Part of me wanted to skip the cemetery visit entirely, to stay home where it was safe and warm and uncomplicated. But something stronger pulled me there, a need to prove to myself that I had been overthinking everything, that this Sunday the roses wouldn't be there, and I could finally let this ridiculous worry go. I drove slowly, rehearsing in my mind the relief I would feel when I crested that hill and saw only my wilted lilies from last week, alone and undisturbed, on Robert's grave. Maybe I'd even laugh at myself for being so paranoid. Maybe this whole strange episode would become a funny story I'd tell my daughter someday about how grief had made me temporarily irrational. But as I walked up the familiar path, my heart began to sink with each step. Even from a distance, I could see them, fresh flowers on Robert's grave. My pace slowed as dread pooled in my stomach. When I got close enough to see clearly, my breath caught in my throat. The roses were there again, not just a simple bouquet this time, but an extravagant arrangement of at least 24 red roses in an expensive crystal vase that caught the gray morning light. My wilted lilies from last week had been moved to the side, almost pushed away, as if they were an afterthought, an inconvenience. But this time, there was something else. Something that made my hands go cold despite my gloves. A small white card was tucked among the roses. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at that card like it might bite me. The wind whipped around me, pulling at my coat, but I barely felt it. My entire focus narrowed to that small rectangle of white paper. With trembling fingers, I reached out and pulled the card from the roses. It was elegant stationery, expensive, with gold edges that gleamed even in the dull morning light. The kind of card you don't buy at a drugstore, the kind you order specially or purchase at a high-end boutique. I opened it slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The words were written in graceful, flowing handwriting. "To my beloved husband from your devoted wife, forever yours." I read it once, twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. Each time they hit me like a physical blow. "Beloved husband, your devoted wife, forever yours." The cemetery spun around me. I grabbed Robert's headstone with one hand to steady myself, feeling the cold granite under my palm, his name carved there, Robert James Hayes, beloved husband and father, my Robert, my husband, the only husband I thought he'd ever had. Someone else was claiming him. Someone else was calling themselves his wife. Someone else believed they had the right to leave roses and love notes at his grave. My knees buckled, and I sank down onto the cold, wet grass, still clutching that card in my shaking hand. The crystal vase full of roses towered above me, mocking me with their beauty and expense. 47 years of marriage, and someone else was signing cards as his devoted wife. Who was she? And how long had she been there? I don't know how long I knelt there in the cold grass, staring at that card until the words blurred together. My mind was racing through decades of memories, searching frantically for clues I must have missed, signs I should have seen. Who could possibly believe she was Robert's wife? And why would she think she had any right to claim him now? Then something made me flip the card over. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. On the back there was more writing, different from the formal message on the front. This was more personal, more intimate. And the moment I saw that handwriting, my entire world stopped spinning. I knew that handwriting. Even after 40 years, I recognized it instantly. The slanted script, the way the letters looped together, the distinctive way she crossed her T's. I had seen this handwriting before, decades ago, in letters I had tried so hard to forget. Letters I had found hidden in Robert's briefcase when I was 8 months pregnant with Tommy. Letters that had nearly destroyed our marriage. Catherine Winters. The name exploded in my mind like a bomb, bringing with it a flood of memories I had buried deep. Catherine had been Robert's co-worker at Morrison & Associates back in the early 1980s. I had found their correspondence one afternoon while looking for Robert's insurance papers. Love letters, passionate and detailed, tucked away where he thought I'd never find them. I could still remember sitting on our bedroom floor, pregnant and sobbing, reading words my husband had written to another woman. When I confronted Robert that night, he had cried. Actually cried. He begged for my forgiveness, swore on our children's lives that it was just an emotional affair, that nothing physical had ever happened. "It was a mistake, Ellie," he'd said, holding my hands, his eyes red and desperate. A stupid mistake. I never touched her, I swear. It was just letters, just talking. I was confused and scared about becoming a father again. But I love you. Only you. Please, please forgive me. We had gone to marriage counseling. Our pastor had mediated long, painful sessions where Robert promised over and over that he had ended it completely, that Catherine meant nothing, that our family was everything. He quit his job at Morrison and Associates and found a new position at a different insurance company. We moved to a new neighborhood. We rebuilt our life brick by brick. I had forgiven him because I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, because we had 3 children and a mortgage and a life together. I looked down at the card again, my vision blurring with tears I couldn't hold back. The message on the back read, "My darling Robert, 40 years wasn't enough. I'll love you until I join you. You're Kathy." 40 years. Not 40 years ago. 40 years of continuous love. She hadn't ended it when Robert promised me she had. She had been there all along. While I was raising our children, ironing his shirts, making his pot roast, holding his hand through cancer, she had been there. Somewhere in the shadows of our entire marriage, Catherine had remained, not as a past mistake, as an ongoing presence, an ongoing lie. I doubled over on the cold ground, my body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know I could hurt that much. I don't remember driving home. One moment I was at the cemetery, and the next I was sitting in my driveway, the card still clutched in my hand, my face wet with tears. The logical part of my brain that had kept me functioning through grief suddenly roared to life with a single, burning question. If Catherine had been there for 40 years, what else had I missed? I walked into the house like a woman possessed. I went straight to Robert's study, the room I had barely touched since his death. It still smelled like him. His cologne, old books, the faint scent of the cigars he thought I didn't know about. I had left everything exactly as it was, a shrine to a man I thought I knew. Now I tore through it like a detective at a crime scene. I started with the filing cabinet, pulling out folders of insurance documents, old tax returns, investment statements. At first, everything looked normal. Our joint accounts, our retirement funds, the savings we had built together over decades. But then I noticed something odd. There were gaps in the account statements, missing months, and some of the numbers didn't add up with what I remembered seeing on our tax returns. My hands moved faster, more frantically. I opened every drawer in his desk, dumped out every box, searched behind every book on the shelves. And then, in the back of his closet, hidden behind a stack of old tax returns in a box labeled 1997-2000, I found it. A locked metal box I had never seen before. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. I searched for the key, finally finding it taped to the bottom of a desk drawer. With shaking hands, I opened the box. Letters. Hundreds of letters tied in bundles with ribbon, spanning decades. I recognized Catherine's handwriting immediately. I pulled out the most recent bundle and began reading. These weren't just love letters, they were detailed accounts of a life I knew nothing about. Weekend trips Robert had taken for work conferences that were actually romantic getaways with Catherine. Hotels in cities I recognized from his business trips. Photos of them together, recent photos from last year, the year before, going back decades. Robert's arm around her waist, the two of them on a beach somewhere tropical. Catherine wearing jewelry I had never seen. My stomach turned. But then I found something that made me actually gasp out loud. Bank statements. An account I had never known existed, at a bank I had never heard of, in both Robert's name and Catherine's. I spread them across the floor, my hands shaking as I added up the numbers in my head. Over the past 20 years, Robert had transferred nearly $400,000 to this account. $400,000. Money from his bonuses, from investments I thought we owned together, from his retirement fund that was supposed to support me in my widowhood. But the worst was yet to come. At the very bottom of the box, folded carefully, was a legal document dated just 2 months before Robert's death, a revised will. I read it once, then again, unable to believe what I was seeing. Robert had left Catherine a significant portion of his estate, including half the value of our house. My house. The house where I had raised our children, the house where I had cared for him until he died. I sat on the floor of Robert's study surrounded by evidence of a double life, and I felt something inside me shatter completely. Not just my heart, that had broken at the cemetery. This was deeper. This was the complete disintegration of everything I had believed about my own existence. The afternoon light faded to evening, then to darkness, and I couldn't move. I sat there in the dark, letters scattered around me like fallen leaves, that revised will still in my hands, and I tried to understand how a person could live a lie for 40 years. How do you kiss your wife goodnight, make love to her, hold her hand through chemotherapy, and then wake up and continue betraying her? How do you do that for 40 years? Every single memory I had was now contaminated, poisoned. Our wedding day, that young man standing at the altar promising to forsake all others, had he already been thinking of Catherine? The births of our children, when I was in labor with Michelle, crying and scared, and Robert held my hand and called me brave. Had he wished Catherine was the mother of his children? Our anniversary trips, the romantic dinners, the quiet Sunday mornings, had every single one been a performance? I thought about all those business trips, all those conferences, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Atlanta. I had packed his suitcase for every single one, ironed his shirts, tucked little love notes into his pockets telling him I'd miss him, and he had taken my notes and my carefully packed clothes to hotel rooms where he met another woman, where he lived another life. The cruelest part was the recent betrayal. I could have maybe forgiven an affair 40 years ago, a mistake he had corrected. But these photos were recent. These letters were recent. That bank account had transactions from last year, last month. While I was crushing his pills, managing his pain medication schedule, sleeping in a chair next to his bed so I could hear him if he needed me in the night, he had been planning to give half of everything to her. I looked at our wedding photo hanging on the wall, visible even in the darkness. That young woman in the white dress who believed in forever, who trusted completely. She was a fool. She had given everything to a man who had been systematically stealing from her for decades, not just money. He had stolen her youth, her trust, her whole life. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made. I had turned down a principal position at another school because it would have meant relocating, and Robert's career was just taking off. I had managed our home and raised our children largely alone during his busy seasons at work. I had waited up for him countless nights, worried when he was late, believed every excuse about traffic and difficult clients and last-minute meetings. And for what? To be the placeholder wife while he built a secret life with another woman? To be the faithful idiot who never questioned, never suspected, never demanded the truth? The worst part was that I couldn't even confront him. He was gone. I couldn't scream at him, couldn't demand answers, couldn't ask the one question that was tearing me apart. Why wasn't I enough? I cried until I had no tears left, until my body ached and my throat was raw, and still I sat there in the darkness surrounded by lies. I woke up on the study floor at dawn, stiff and cold, my cheek pressed against the hardwood. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was or why every muscle in my body ached. Then I saw the letters scattered around me, the bank statements, that revised will, and everything came crashing back. But something was different this morning. The crushing grief from last night had transformed into something else overnight, something harder, something sharper, anger. Not the wild, desperate, sobbing kind of anger from yesterday. This was cold and clear and focused, like ice water in my veins. I sat up slowly, my back protesting, and looked at myself in the reflection of the window. I looked terrible. My eyes swollen and red, my hair a mess, my clothes wrinkled from sleeping on the floor. I looked like a victim. But I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. Catherine thought she could show up at my husband's grave and claim him as hers. She thought she could leave romantic cards signed as his devoted wife while I stood there like an idiot. She thought she could take $400,000 of money that should have supported me through my widowhood. She thought she deserved half of my home, the home where I had raised Robert's children, the home where I had cared for him until his last breath. Absolutely not. No, I refused. I might have been the fool who didn't see a 40-year affair happening right under my nose. I might have been too trusting, too devoted, too blind. But I was not going to roll over and let them steal what remained of my life. Not after death. Not when I finally knew the truth. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest, and walked to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I looked old, exhausted, completely broken. But somewhere underneath that broken exterior, I saw something else. I saw a woman who had survived 47 years of marriage, who had raised 3 successful children essentially on her own, who had taught hundreds of students, who had managed a household and a career simultaneously. I saw a woman who had already survived one betrayal 40 years ago and had found the strength to rebuild. I could do it again, but this time, I wouldn't just rebuild. This time, I would fight. I spent that entire day organizing every piece of evidence I had found. The letters, the photographs, the bank statements, the revised will. I sorted them chronologically, methodically, creating a timeline of systematic deception. I made copies of everything, storing the originals in a safe deposit box at the bank. I documented every dollar that had been transferred, every trip that matched up with letters from Catherine, every lie that I could now see clearly. Then I picked up the phone and made a call I should have made 40 years ago when I first found those letters. Henderson and Associates Law Firm. How may I help you? I took a deep breath, and when I spoke, my voice was steady and cold. I need to speak to an attorney about estate fraud and inheritance rights, and I need someone who isn't afraid of a complicated, messy case. There was a pause. May I ask what this is regarding? Theft, I said clearly, and 40 years of lies. Jennifer Henderson turned out to be exactly what I needed. A sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with short gray hair and an expression that said she'd seen everything and wasn't easily shocked. But when I walked into her office on Tuesday morning with 2 boxes full of evidence and told her my story, I saw her eyebrows rise. I laid it all out on her conference table. The letters spanning 40 years, the photographs, the secret bank statements, the revised will, even the cards from the cemetery. I spoke calmly, factually, like I was presenting a case study rather than the destruction of my own life. Jennifer examined every document carefully, making notes, occasionally asking questions. The more she read, the more her expression hardened. Eleanor, she finally said, looking up at me with something like respect in her eyes, this is actually more straightforward than you might think. That revised will was never properly filed with the probate court, and from what I can see, it wasn't properly witnessed according to state law. It's legally meaningless. He can't disinherit you from beyond the grave. Relief flooded through me, but she held up a hand. The financial transfers are more complicated, but we have options. If these funds came from joint accounts or retirement benefits that were legally yours as a surviving spouse, we can absolutely contest them. Connecticut has strong laws protecting surviving spouses from this kind of asset depletion. But, Eleanor, we need to move carefully and quickly. Over the next hour, we crafted a plan that was both elegant and devastating. First, Jennifer would send a formal cease and desist letter to Catherine Winters, informing her that any claims she believed she had on Robert's estate were invalid and demanding the return of all funds transferred from marital accounts. We would give her 10 days to respond before escalating to litigation. Second, Jennifer advised me to inform my children before Catherine could contact them with her version of events. They need to hear this from you, she said gently, and you'll need their support for what comes next. That was the hardest phone call I ever made. I conference called all 3 of my children that evening and told them everything. Michelle cried. Robert Jr. was so angry I could hear him pacing, his voice shaking with rage at his father. Tommy just kept saying, I don't understand, over and over, like a broken record. But after the shock wore off, they rallied behind me. We're with you, Mom, Michelle said fiercely. Whatever you need, Dad doesn't get to do this to you. While we waited for Catherine's response, I took Jennifer's next piece of advice and hired a private investigator. Within a week, he delivered a report that was almost satisfying in its thoroughness. Catherine had been telling people in her social circle for years that she was Robert's real wife, that I was just an old arrangement he stayed in for financial convenience and the children. She had collected sympathy as the long-suffering mistress who deserved recognition. The investigator also found something perfect: Catherine's social media accounts, which she hadn't bothered to make private. Photos from trips with Robert going back years, tagged with romantic captions and location tags that matched up perfectly with his business conferences. A public documented record of the affair, evidence we could use to destroy her credibility completely. When Catherine's response finally arrived, it was exactly as arrogant as I had hoped. Catherine's response letter arrived by certified mail on a Thursday afternoon. I signed for it with steady hands, Jennifer on speakerphone as I opened the envelope. The letter was typed on expensive letterhead from a law firm in Hartford. She'd hired serious representation, which told me she was taking this as seriously as we were. But the content of the letter was breathtaking in its audacity. Catherine's attorney claimed that all funds transferred to her were gifts freely given by Robert Hayes, that there was no legal prohibition against a man spending his own money as he chose, and that their 40-year relationship entitled her to consideration and respect regarding Robert's final wishes. The letter concluded by suggesting that I should honor what Robert truly wanted, rather than clinging to a marriage that existed in name only. I read that last line 3 times, my hands trembling with rage. A marriage that existed in name only, as if 47 years, 3 children, and watching my husband die didn't count for anything. Perfect, Jennifer said over the phone, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. This is exactly what we needed. She's not showing any remorse, any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. This makes our case much stronger. Jennifer filed a lawsuit the following Monday, citing estate law, fraudulent transfer statutes, and spousal rights protections under Connecticut law. We also filed for a restraining order preventing Catherine from visiting Robert's grave or contacting me or my children. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, November 28th, the day before Thanksgiving. As the date approached, something unexpected happened. The story began to leak. It started with a post on a local news blog that covered legal disputes and estate cases in our county. Someone, perhaps from Catherine's social circle, maybe feeling guilty or perhaps just loving drama, had sent them an anonymous tip. The article was titled, "Local Widow Discovers 40-Year Affair After Husband's Death, Now Fighting for Her Rights in Court." The article was surprisingly sympathetic to me, painting Catherine as a homewrecker who was now trying to steal from a grieving 72-year-old widow. Within days, it had been shared hundreds of times on local Facebook groups. My phone started ringing constantly. Friends from church I hadn't heard from in months, former colleagues from the elementary school, even some of my old students who were now adults with families of their own. Everyone offered support, outrage on my behalf, prayers. My children came to stay with me the week before the hearing. Michelle took time off work and brought the boys. Robert Jr. flew in from Colorado with his wife. Tommy drove up from Boston. They surrounded me like a protective wall, and for the first time since finding those roses, I didn't feel alone. The Saturday before the court hearing, I did something bold. I went back to the cemetery one final time before the trial, and just as I expected, there were fresh roses on Robert's grave with another card from Catherine, despite the pending restraining order. But this time, I didn't cry. This time, I took photographs, clear evidence of her continued harassment. Then I picked up her expensive roses, walked them to the cemetery trash bin, and threw them away. I placed my lilies on the grave and stood there, looking at Robert's name carved in stone. "You don't own me anymore," I whispered. "And neither does she." The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, but it felt packed with tension. My 3 children sat directly behind me in the first row, a united front of support. I could feel their presence like a shield at my back. Across the aisle, Catherine sat with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man in an expensive suit who looked like he charged $500 an hour. This was the first time I had seen Catherine in person in 40 years, and the sight of her hit me like a physical blow. She was put together and polished, wearing a black dress that was probably designer, her hair professionally styled, makeup perfect. She looked younger than me, even though we were roughly the same age. She had the appearance of someone who had been carefully maintained, pampered, invested in. And I understood immediately. She'd been living off our money, my money, looking expensive while I had been clipping coupons and bargain shopping. The judge entered, and we all stood. Judge Morrison was an older man with gray hair and reading glasses that he kept adjusting as he reviewed the case files. Jennifer had told me he was fair but no nonsense, that he didn't tolerate games in his courtroom. Jennifer presented our case methodically, like she was building a house brick by brick. She displayed the secret bank account statements on a screen, showing the transfers over 20 years. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, sometimes $25,000 at once. The numbers added up to $412,000. She showed the timeline of Robert's business trips that corresponded with romantic getaways documented in Catherine's letters and social media posts. She presented the unsigned will as evidence of intent to defraud me of my rightful inheritance. Catherine's attorney argued that Robert had made these gifts of his own free will, that what a man chooses to do with his money is his business, that there's no law against maintaining a long-term relationship outside of marriage. He painted Catherine as a woman who had loved Robert faithfully for 40 years and deserved recognition for her devotion. I felt sick listening to him twist the narrative, making Catherine sound like some kind of romantic heroine instead of the woman who had helped destroy my marriage. Then Jennifer did something brilliant. She called Catherine to the witness stand. Catherine walked up confidently, head held high like she had nothing to hide. She was sworn in and sat down, crossing her ankles elegantly. "Ms. Winters," Jennifer began, her voice calm and professional, "you've claimed that Mr. Hayes gave you these funds freely as gifts. Were you aware that he was married throughout your entire relationship?" Catherine's lawyer objected, but Judge Morrison overruled. "Answer the question, Ms. Winters." Catherine lifted her chin defiantly. "Yes, I knew he was married, but Robert told me repeatedly that his marriage was a formality, that he stayed for his children, but that I was his real partner, his true love. We were together for 40 years. That's longer than most marriages last." There were gasps from the gallery. I felt Michelle's hand squeeze my shoulder from behind me. Jennifer didn't miss a beat. "And did you believe you had a right to his estate when he died?" "I believe I had as much right as anyone," Catherine said, her voice growing passionate. "I loved him. I was with him through everything. I supported his dreams. But you weren't his wife, were you, Ms. Winters?" Jennifer's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. "But you weren't his wife, were you, Ms. Winters?" Catherine's composure cracked slightly. Her mouth tightened. "In every way that mattered, I was. Eleanor was just—" She stopped herself, but Jennifer pressed forward. "Just what, Ms. Winters? Please finish your sentence. Eleanor was just what?" Catherine's face flushed. "She was just the official arrangement, the legal paperwork. But Robert and I had the real relationship. We had passion, connection, a life together that she knew nothing about." "A life built on deception and lies," Jennifer said coldly. a life funded by money that legally belonged to Mrs. Hayes as his spouse. Catherine's attorney objected, but the damage was done. I could see the judge's expression hardening as he watched Catherine. Then Jennifer played her final card, the one we had been saving. She pulled out her laptop and connected it to the courtroom's display screen. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that shows this wasn't just a relationship, but a calculated scheme to defraud Mrs. Hayes of her marital assets." The screen lit up with text messages, thousands of them recovered from the secret phone I had found. Jennifer had organized them carefully, and now she began reading them aloud in a steady, damning voice. Messages where Robert complained about me, calling me boring and predictable. Messages where he said he couldn't wait to be done with this obligation. Messages where Catherine encouraged him to leave me, to file the new will, to finally put yourself first. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for Jennifer's voice. Then came the messages that changed everything. Text conversations from 2 years ago, when Robert first received his cancer diagnosis. Catherine hadn't been sympathetic. She'd been strategic. Jennifer read aloud, "This might be our only chance, Robert. You need to secure my future before it's too late. Go to the attorney. Update the will. Transfer what you can now. We've waited 40 years. We deserve this." My hands clenched in my lap. Behind me, I heard Michelle stifle a sob. But Jennifer wasn't finished. She presented phone records showing that Catherine had accompanied Robert to an estate attorney's office 8 weeks before his death. The same visit where he had tried to file the revised will that would have disinherited me. "Ms. Winters wasn't just accepting gifts, Your Honor," Jennifer said, her voice ringing with controlled anger. "She systematically encouraged and assisted Mr. Hayes in hiding assets from his legal wife. She knew he was terminally ill. She knew his judgment might be impaired by pain medication and the emotional distress of facing death, and she used that vulnerability to secure money and property that rightfully belonged to Mrs. Hayes." Jennifer pulled up one final document, an email from Catherine to Robert dated 6 weeks before his death. The email reads, "The house alone is worth $450,000. If you leave me half like you promised, I'll finally have security. Eleanor will be fine. She has her teacher's pension. But I've given you 40 years. I deserve to be taken care of." The judge removed his glasses and looked directly at Catherine. His expression was no longer neutral. It was disgusted. "Ms. Winters," he said slowly, "this court does not look kindly on financial exploitation of the elderly or dying." Catherine's face went white as snow. The judge took only 20 minutes to deliberate, barely enough time for me to use the restroom and splash cold water on my face. When we were called back into the courtroom, my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Michelle held my hand on one side, Robert Jr. on the other. Judge Morrison entered, his expression stern and unreadable. We all stood, then sat again when he gestured. He put on his reading glasses and looked directly at Catherine before speaking. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented today, and I want to be absolutely clear about my findings," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Ms. Winters, your testimony and the documentary evidence paint a disturbing picture of financial exploitation. You knowingly and systematically encouraged a terminally ill man to divert marital assets away from his legal spouse. You were present at legal proceedings intended to disinherit Mrs. Hayes. Your own words, preserved in text messages and emails, show calculated manipulation during Mr. Hayes's final months of life." Catherine's attorney started to stand, but the judge held up his hand. "The revised will presented as evidence was never properly executed, witnessed, or filed. It has no legal standing whatsoever. Furthermore, the transfers of funds from joint marital accounts and retirement benefits constitute fraudulent conveyance intended to shield assets from the legal spouse. Under Connecticut general statutes regarding spousal rights and estate law, these transfers are voidable." I held my breath, afraid to believe what I was hearing. Therefore, I am ordering Ms. Winters to return the full sum of $412,000 to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes within 90 days. Should Ms. Winters fail to comply, the court will authorize seizure of assets and wage garnishment to satisfy this judgment. Additionally, I am awarding Mrs. Hayes full court costs and reasonable attorney fees. Relief washed over me like a wave. Behind me, I heard Tommy whisper, "Yes," and Michelle squeezing my hand so hard it hurt, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, the permanent restraining order preventing Ms. Winters from visiting the grave site or contacting Mrs. Hayes or any member of her family is hereby granted and will remain in effect indefinitely. Any violation will result in contempt charges. He looked at Catherine with undisguised disapproval. Ms. Winters, whatever relationship you had with Mr. Hayes, it did not entitle you to steal from his widow. This court will not reward deception and financial abuse. Case closed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Catherine's face had gone from white to gray. Her attorney was already whispering urgently in her ear, probably discussing appeal options, but Jennifer had assured me they had no grounds. The evidence was too clear, too damning. As we stood to leave, I looked across the aisle one final time. Catherine was staring at me, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw anger there, and humiliation, but also something else. The realization that she had lost. After 40 years of hiding in shadows, of being the secret, she had tried to step into the light and claim what was mine, and I had stopped her. My children surrounded me as we walked out of the courthouse into the cold November air, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. 6 months after the trial, I found myself kneeling in the garden of my new home, my hands deep in the rich Ohio soil, planting peonies and daisies. The cottage I had bought was small but bright, with big windows that let in the morning sun and a wrap-around porch where I could drink my coffee and watch the birds. It was only 20 minutes from Michelle's house, close enough that my grandsons could ride their bikes over to visit me. I had sold the yellow house on Maple Street without looking back. Too many ghosts lived in those rooms. Too many lies had been spoken over dinner at that kitchen table. Too many nights I had slept beside a stranger without knowing it. The new owners were a young couple with a baby on the way, full of hope and plans. I wished them better luck than I'd had. Catherine had returned the money in installments over 4 months, liquidating investments and probably taking out loans to pay what she owed. I didn't care how difficult it was for her. She had stolen from me for years. Now she was simply returning what was never hers to begin with. With that money, I established college funds for all 5 of my grandchildren, donated $50,000 to the cancer center that had cared for Robert in his final days. They deserved it more than he did, and invested the rest in secure funds that would support me through whatever years I had left. I joined a book club in my new town where nobody knew my story, where I was just Eleanor, the retired teacher who loved mysteries and always brought homemade cookies to meetings. I started volunteering at the local library, reading to children on Saturday mornings, losing myself in their innocent wonder at stories. I took a watercolor painting class and discovered I was actually pretty good at it. Slowly, carefully, I began building a life that was authentically mine. Not a performance, not a role I was playing, but something real. My grandson Tommy, named after my youngest son, asked me one afternoon while we were planting tulip bulbs together, "Grandma, are you still sad about Grandpa?" I thought about it carefully before answering. Children deserve honesty, even about hard things. "I'm sad about the time I lost believing in something that wasn't real," I told him, brushing dirt off my knees. "But I'm not sad about who I am now. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us teach us the most important lessons, that we're stronger than we think, that we deserve honesty and respect, and that it's never too late to fight for ourselves." He nodded, seriously processing this in the way children do, then went back to digging holes for the bulbs. Here's what I learned from 47 years of marriage built on lies. Trust isn't something you give once and forget about. It should be earned and re-earned throughout a relationship. Financial transparency in marriage isn't being nosy or controlling. It's protecting yourself and your future. And most importantly, being a devoted, faithful partner doesn't guarantee you'll receive the same in return, but it does mean you deserve justice when you don't. If someone is deceiving you, there are always signs. Always. The question isn't whether the signs are there, it's whether you're willing to see them. I ignored the signs 40 years ago when I first found those letters. I convinced myself that forgiveness meant forgetting, that trusting meant never questioning. I was wrong. Real trust is built on transparency and consistency, not blind faith. For 40 years, I told myself I had a strong marriage because we never fought, because Robert came home every night, because he said he loved me. But I confused the absence of conflict with the presence of honesty. I mistook routine for intimacy. I accepted surface-level connection and called it love.